There is a painting in Madrid that has been making people deeply uncomfortable for over 500 years. It sits in the Museo del Prado, a triptych of wooden panels that opens like a great illuminated book, the Garden of Earthly Delights. Some have called it a warning, some have called it a fantasy, some have called it the first surrealist painting, 400 years before surrealism was invented, but very few people know that it was commissioned by a deeply conservative religious brotherhood. Why on earth would they do that? In 1488, Hieronymus Bosch became a sworn member of the Brotherhood of Our Lady, the illustrious Brotherhood of Our Lady, to give it its full and rather grand title. A religious confraternity based in the Dutch city of 's-Hertogenbosch, which was also the city where Bosch was born and where he would die. The Brotherhood was arch-conservative, deeply orthodox, and enormously prestigious. Its 40 sworn members, the inner circle, were among the most influential citizens of the region. Its outer membership of roughly 7,000 souls stretched across Europe, representing the religious, cultural, and mercantile elite of the late medieval world. These were not the people you would expect to be lining up to hang pictures of hellfish and musical instrument torture chambers in their chapels. And yet they did. And therein lies one of the most tantalizing puzzles in the history of Western art, a city that no longer exists. To understand Bosch, to even begin to understand him, you have to understand 's-Hertogenbosch, the city that made him. It no longer exists in any meaningful sense, not as it was then. Today it is a pleasant Dutch town of about 150,000 people, known for its medieval cathedral and a peculiar local pastry called a Bosche bol. In Bosch's time it was something far more alive and far more frightening. In the late 15th century, 's-Hertogenbosch was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the Low Countries, which is to say one of the most prosperous places on earth. Trade moved through it like blood through a heart. German merchants brought cloth and silver. Italian bankers set up offices. The textile industry hummed. The city was cosmopolitan in the way that trading cities are always cosmopolitan. It was also a city living in a state of spiritual emergency. This sounds strange to modern ears, but it would have sounded entirely natural to anyone alive in 1480. The Black Death had come and gone, and come again, leaving behind a landscape scarred by mass graves and a population permanently altered in its relationship to death. The church was fracturing. Luther was still 30 years away, but the corruption of the clergy was an open secret, the subject of tavern arguments and carnival satire. Witchcraft trials were multiplying. The end of the world, which every educated European had been expecting more or less continuously since the year 1000, felt, in this particular century, genuinely imminent. The printing press had just been invented, and among the first bestsellers it produced were illustrated guides to dying well and screaming woodcuts of the apocalypse. Into this atmosphere, Hieronymus Bosch was born, probably around 1450, into a family of painters. His real name was Jeroen van Aken, and he adopted the name of his city in Latinized form as his professional identity, in the way that craftsmen sometimes did. We know almost nothing about his training, his travels, or his private life. What we know is that he became, by his 40s, the most sought-after artist in the Netherlands, and possibly in all of Northern Europe. He painted things no one had painted before. There was a tradition of depicting hell, certainly. Dante had described it, and the church had preached it. Earlier painters had sketched its outlines. But Bosch did something different. He made hell specific, inventive, almost playful. His devils were bizarre, procedurally strange, as though they had been designed by a committee of nightmares following rules from a manual that no human being had ever written. The Brotherhood in its world, the Brotherhood of Our Lady, had been founded in 1318, making it, by Bosch's time, already 170 years old. It had survived plagues, wars, political upheavals, and the general chaos of late medieval Dutch life with a remarkable institutional steadiness. It venerated the Virgin Mary, funded elaborate religious ceremonies, maintained an altar in the Cathedral of St. John, a breathtaking Gothic structure still standing in the modern city, and cultivated a reputation for orthodox piety that was both genuine and, like all reputations, carefully managed. What it was not was a society of secret mystics or hidden heretics. This is a tempting narrative, the conservative brotherhood secretly harbouring transgressive art. But the evidence does not support it. The Brotherhood's membership records, its account books, its ritual documents, All of these survive, and all of them speak to an organization that took its religious orthodoxy with great seriousness. They were conservatives in the deepest sense of that word. They believed the world had an order, ordained by God, and their purpose was to uphold it, which makes their relationship with Bosch all the more fascinating. Bosch was not merely a member of the Brotherhood, he was a celebrated one. The Brotherhood commissioned work from him, paid him fees and, most tellingly, paid him well. When he died in 1516, the Brotherhood organised a funeral mass in his honour at the Cathedral of St. John. This was not the treatment you gave a hired hand. This was the treatment you gave someone you considered, in some important sense, your own. Either they were hypocrites using him as cover, or the paintings were never meant to shock. They were meant to instruct. So the question crystallises, did the Brotherhood know what they were getting? And if they knew, and they must have known, because Bosch's style was already fully formed by the time he joined, and his reputation had preceded him, then why did they want it? The conventional reading established in the 19th century, and still the most common one taught in survey courses, is that the centre panel is a condemnation of carnal sin. Look at all these people enjoying themselves, and look where it leads. The garden is a trap. The pleasure is temporary. The hell that follows is permanent. But this reading has always had a problem, and the problem is that the centre panel is too beautiful. Not the lurid, winking beauty of temptation, designed to be recognised and resisted. The genuine, bewildering, almost ecstatic beauty of a world imagined with love. Bosch's naked figures are not grotesque. They are graceful. The enormous fruits they inhabit are luscious. The crystal towers catch a light that feels, despite everything, like the light of a good world. If this is a condemnation, it is a condemnation in which the artist has clearly fallen in love with the thing he is condemning. This is where modern scholarship has begun to complicate the picture. Art historians like Reindert Falkenberg and Lotta Brand Philipp have spent careers arguing that Bosch was not simply a moralist with a peculiar visual imagination. He was a theologian, a lay theologian, working in paint rather than in Latin, but a theologian nonetheless. Someone who had thought systematically about what sin was, how it worked, why it was so seductive, and what its consequences looked like when you followed them to their logical extreme. The garden is not a warning in the simple sense of a sign reading, "Danger cliff edge." It is a meditation, a sustained, intricate, terrifyingly honest meditation on what human beings are, on what it means to be a creature made for heaven, who keeps choosing, again and again, the gorgeous and the immediate over the eternal and the true. The devotio moderna and the examined soul. Here is where the Brotherhood's conservatism stops being a paradox and starts being an explanation. In the decades before Bosch's birth, the Low Countries had become the centre of a spiritual movement called the devotio moderna, the modern devotion, which represented something genuinely new in Christian thought, though it would not have described itself that way. The movement's founder, Geert Groot, had died in 1384, but his ideas had spread throughout the Netherlands and into Germany with a speed that suggests they were meeting a need that other forms of piety were failing to meet. The devotio moderna was, at its core, a movement about interiority. It held that the spiritual life could not be reduced to external performance. Attending Mass, buying indulgences, making donations to the church. True piety required self-examination. Relentless, uncomfortable, systematic self-examination. You had to look at yourself honestly. You had to know your own sins, not as an abstract category, but as specific failures you had committed on specific days for specific reasons. You had to trace the anatomy of your own corruption. The great text of this movement was Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, written around 1418, and destined to become, after the Bible, the most widely reproduced book in Christian history. À Kempis wrote with a directness that could still make a 21st century reader flinch. What doth it profit thee to enter into deep discussion concerning the Holy Trinity if thou lack humility? The question is not rhetorical. It is a scalpel. The Brotherhood of Our Lady and Hertogen Bosch was deeply shaped by this tradition. Its emphasis on personal piety, on the examination of conscience, on the cultivation of interior virtue over external show. They represented a specific and demanding approach to the spiritual life, one that required its practitioners to become experts in their own capacity for self-deception. And who better to assist in that project than an artist who had made himself the supreme visual analyst of how sin actually works. Bosch did not paint hell as a place you went to after a life of obvious wickedness, after murder and blasphemy, and the great theatrical sins that everyone could easily identify and condemn. He painted hell as the logical end of choices that felt, at the time, entirely reasonable. His sinners are people who wanted things: pleasure, comfort, distraction, the satisfaction of appetite. They followed those wants, and followed them, and this is where the following led. For a brotherhood whose entire spiritual project was teaching its members to recognize and resist exactly those reasonable feeling choices, this was not disturbing imagery. It was essential imagery. It was a visual curriculum, the patron's eye. We must also reckon with the fact that we do not see these paintings the way their original audience saw them. We encounter Bosch in museums, usually the Prado, surrounded by the particular kind of reverential hush that modern culture drapes over great art, under lighting designed to show every brushstroke, with the paintings hung at viewing height on clean walls and accompanied by explanatory text that tells us, in careful academic language, what we are looking at. We come to them already knowing they are famous, already prepared to be impressed or puzzled or unnerved. Bosch's original audience came to his paintings in a completely different context. Many of his works were made for chapels, private or semi-private spaces of prayer and meditation. The Garden of Earthly Delights itself was probably made for the private chambers of a noble patron, where it would have been opened and closed, its shuttered exterior showing a grisaille image of the creation, its interior revealed only on certain occasions to certain viewers. The experience would have been nothing like standing in a museum gallery. It would have been intimate, repeated, part of a ritual of looking that was also a ritual of self-examination. In this context, the paintings were tools. Now we look to be entertained or to admire the artist's skill. But back then you looked at them to be changed, to see yourself somewhere in those panels, not the comfortably distant damned, howling in obvious hellfire, but the people in the garden, the naked figures so absorbed in their gorgeous fruits and their pleasant diversions that they cannot see, or will not see, where the garden ends and the fire begins. The Brotherhood would have understood this perfectly. These were people who prayed and examined themselves and prayed again, who had built an entire institutional culture around the cultivation of spiritual vigilance. They would have recognized a tool when they saw one, even, especially, a tool that looked to an outside observer like something else entirely. Of course, not everyone has accepted this benign interpretation. There is a long tradition, beginning with the Spanish friar José de Sigüenza, who wrote about Bosch in 1605, and continuing through various 20th century scholars, of arguing that the paintings contain a hidden message, that Bosch was secretly something other than what he appeared, a heretic, an initiate, a member of some clandestine sect whose beliefs were so far outside Catholic orthodoxy that they could only be expressed in code. The most persistent version of this argument holds that Bosch was associated with the Adamites, a sect that, according to their critics, believed that the truly enlightened soul could return to the state of prelapsarian innocence that Adam and Eve had enjoyed before the fall, and that in this state of recovered innocence, the conventional sexual prohibitions of the Church no longer applied. The naked bodies in the centre panel of the garden, on this reading, are saints, freed from sin, living in a recovered paradise. It is more comfortable, in a peculiar way, to believe that Bosch was a secret rebel than to believe he was a sincere Catholic. The secret rebel is familiar. We have a template for him, the artist ahead of his time, seeing through the repressive orthodoxies of his age. The sincere Catholic who produces images of such hallucinatory strangeness is harder to accommodate. It requires us to take seriously the idea that Orthodox Christianity, at its most intense and most honest, might generate a vision of the world that looks from the outside like madness. Sin a system. The philosopher and art theorist W.J.T. Mitchell once argued that what distinguishes great visual art from merely competent visual art is that great art forces you to think about seeing itself, about the act of looking, and what it means and what it reveals about the looker. By this measure, Bosch is perhaps the greatest visual artist who ever lived. Because Bosch's paintings are not simply about sin. They are about the psychology of sin, about how sin works from the inside. And the insight at the centre of that psychology, the insight that gives the paintings their terrible staying power, is that sin is not primarily an act. It is a condition of vision, a way of seeing the world that mistakes the partial for the whole, the temporary for the eternal, the surface for the substance. Look again at the centre panel of the garden. The figures there are not tormented. They are absorbed. That is the point. They are so completely absorbed in what they are doing, climbing into fruits, carrying enormous birds, splashing in pools, that they have lost the capacity to see the wider landscape they inhabit. The hell panel on the right is not a different world from the garden panel. It is the same world, seen clearly at last. The garden and the hell are connected. They always were. The sinners did not travel from one to the other. They were in hell the whole time. They simply could not see it. This is not a comfortable doctrine. It is not the sort of thing that can be communicated by a politely worded sermon, or a tasteful altarpiece showing the Madonna and Child in soft Flemish light. To really communicate it, to make it felt rather than merely understood, you need images that have the same quality the insight describes. Images that look like one thing on the surface and reveal themselves, on longer looking, to be something entirely different. You need art that performs the very movement of awakening that it depicts. Bosch gives us exactly that. His paintings reward sustained looking in a way that almost no other paintings in the Western tradition do. The longer you spend with them, the more you see. Not more of the same kind of thing, but different kinds of things, nested meanings, connections you had not noticed, details that recontextualize everything around them. They are built to resist the absorbed, unself-examining gaze that is precisely the gaze they are warning you against. They wake you up by demanding that you pay attention. His paintings perform the very movement of awakening that they depict. They are built to resist the absorbed gaze that is precisely the gaze they are warning you against. The rabbit hole. And yet, and this is where things become genuinely inexhaustible, the paintings resist any single reading. They resist the devotional reading just as firmly as they resist the heretical reading. They contain more than any interpretation can hold. What is Bosch doing with music? Music, in late medieval theology, was understood as both the most spiritual of the arts, the mode of angelic praise, the closest human approximation of the harmony of the spheres, and the most dangerous, the most seductive, the most likely to distract the soul from its proper attention. The same thing could lead you toward God or away from him, depending on how you used it. This is not a simple morality, it is a complex one, and Bosch is giving it a complex visual form. Or consider the fruit. Strawberries appear throughout the centre panel, enormous and luscious, and slightly alarming, and figures climb into them and eat them and seem to derive some ecstatic experience from them. The strawberry, in the iconographic tradition of the Low Countries, was associated specifically with transient pleasure. Its taste was intense, and its season was short, and it bruised immediately after being picked. To eat a strawberry was to experience something wonderful that you could not hold on to. Bosch fills his garden with them. He is writing in a visual language that his original audience would have been able to read, and what he is writing is not just sin is bad, but something far more nuanced. Pleasure is real, and it is beautiful, and it passes, and to mistake it for a permanent good is the most human error there is. His paintings are diagnostic images. They are what hell looks like when you follow the thread of any ordinary human desire far enough to see where it ends. The Brotherhood of Our Lady hired him because they needed that diagnosis. They were in the business of spiritual health, and Bosch was the finest diagnostician they had. What he knew that we have forgotten. There is a moment that every serious viewer of Bosch eventually has. It comes at different times for different people, sometimes standing before the actual paintings, sometimes in the middle of the night looking at reproductions, sometimes years after a first encounter, when some unrelated experience suddenly throws the paintings into new relief. The moment is a kind of recognition. You realise that you know someone in the paintings, not a specific person, but a type, a recognisable human behaviour, a familiar mode of being in the world, rendered in the visual language of the 15th century, but describing something entirely contemporary. The person so absorbed in their pleasure that they cannot see beyond it. The person confusing the means of happiness for happiness itself. The person climbing into the enormous strawberry. This is Bosch's real achievement. And it is why 500 years have not made him old. He was not painting medieval people. He was painting human beings. He was painting the thing in us that does not change. The thing that the Devotio Moderna was trying to address and that every serious spiritual tradition in every culture has tried to address. the particular genius we have for not seeing what is directly in front of us. The Brotherhood of Our Lady understood this. They were, in their arch-conservative, deeply orthodox, utterly serious way, exactly the right audience for Bosch. They were not hypocrites deploying scandal as a shield. They were people who had devoted their lives to the project of seeing clearly, and they hired the one artist who had mastered the visual grammar of clear sight. That his images looked to outsiders like the productions of a disturbed mind was, from the Brotherhood's perspective, beside the point. Truth often looks like disturbance to those who have not done the work of seeing it. The question that remains: we have been living with Bosch for 5 centuries, and we have not exhausted him. New details are still being discovered in the paintings. Hidden figures, encrypted symbolism, visual jokes so subtle that they require magnification to see at all. The scholarly literature grows every decade. The reproductions multiply. The influence spreads into new media, new cultures, new conversations. None of this would have surprised the Brotherhood of Our Lady. They had commissioned something inexhaustible because inexhaustibility was, in a sense, the point. A painting that you could look at once and understand completely would not serve the purpose. You needed something that kept giving, that kept demanding your attention, that kept catching you out, that kept showing you what you had not been looking at. The great art of the pre-modern world was built on this principle. The great cathedrals with their thousands of carved figures and their stained glass narratives and their columns reaching toward a vault so high you felt looking up at it. The physical sensation of awe. These were not decorative. They were instructional. They were environments designed to produce a specific kind of experience, to orient the soul in a specific direction, to make the invisible visible by making the visible overwhelming. Bosch worked in the same tradition, but at a smaller scale and with a more intimate purpose. The cathedral addressed the crowd, Bosch addressed the individual. He made paintings to be sat with, returned to, wrestled with. Paintings that worked on you the way the Devotio Moderna said spiritual practice should work on you. Slowly, repeatedly, getting under your skin. The Brotherhood did not hire the devil's painter in spite of their conservatism. They hired him because of it. They knew exactly what they were doing. The Brotherhood did not hire Hieronymus Bosch in spite of their conservatism. They hired him because of it. They were conservatives in the oldest and most serious sense. People who believed that something essential about human experience needed to be conserved, protected, passed on. And they recognized in Bosch an artist who had devoted his life to visualizing exactly what happened when that something was lost. Was he a hypocrite? No. Was he a heretic? Almost certainly not. Was he a subversive, a rebel, a proto-modern smuggling descent past the gatekeepers of his age? Not in the way that comfortable narrative suggests. He was something harder to categorize, and more interesting. A true believer with a terrifying visual gift. A man who had looked at the world, and at himself, and at the specific texture of human failure, for long enough that he had developed a grammar for showing it. A grammar so precise and so strange that it has never quite been matched in the history of art. The Brotherhood knew what they had. 5 centuries of viewers have been slowly catching up. The Garden of Earthly Delights hangs in room 056A of the Museo del Prado in Madrid. It is by most accounts the most visited painting in the museum. Visitors stand before it for longer than they stand before almost anything else in the building. They lean in, they point, they photograph it. They step back and look at the whole, then step forward and look at the details, then step back again. Most of them do not know about the Brotherhood of Our Lady. Most of them do not know about the Devotio Moderna, or the theological tradition of self-examination, or the specific iconography of the strawberry and late medieval Flemish painting. They come to it without context, without preparation, without any framework for understanding what it is. And it still works on them. They still feel it. They still recognize something they cannot quite name, something in the space between the garden and the fire. And they still find themselves, against all expectation, unable to look away. Hieronymus Bosch painted for a brotherhood of conservative Christians in a provincial Dutch city in the 15th century, and he made something that speaks to every human being who has ever stood before it. That is either a miracle or the closest thing to one that paint and oak panel can produce. The Brotherhood of Our Lady, in their arch-conservative wisdom, suspected as much. That is why they hired him.